The title for today's talk is Identity, or How to Handle Accusations of Racism. Racism is supposed to be all around us, an invisible, yet all-pervasive force that poisons our societies, but for some reason, no one is able to root out this evil spirit. My intention today is to get to the bottom of this issue by thoroughly investigating it from a scientific, moral, and practical perspectives. So this talk should be helpful to anyone annoyed at being called a racist all the time, but it may be especially useful to those that have a serious interest in being able to defend a position based on their identity. That is to be able to say that someone is another who doesn't belong with you. This talk consists of 3 parts. In the first part, I will spend some time reviewing evidence on the biosciences that will provide the basis for why the other, as a category, exists as a fact. Then I will move on to the philosophical basis for why taking your own side is morally acceptable. Finally, I will wrap up by sharing some real-world advice on how to actually pull this off in practice. Part 1. Science and the other. So what is the scientific basis, if any, for being an other? That is someone who does not belong in your in-group. You are taught pretty much every day that we are all born equal, that we are the same. Any differences that are just obvious are only skin deep or socially constructed, implying that they are in no way immutable. Today, even noticing that someone is different is considered racism, as we really are meant to believe that we are all the same. It is even claimed that this is the scientific truth. So in the next few minutes, I will briefly review some recent bioscience literature to check if this is indeed the case. So why can't we all be equal? The answer to this lies in the most fundamental facts of biology, evolution. In case you are not familiar with the concept, you could think of evolution as how life forms change over time as they become more adapted to their environment. The force behind this change is called natural selection, and the carriers of change are usually referred to as genes or alleles. And as we have all experienced slightly different environments, the frequency of these alleles will be different also. There are 2 issues that we need to address. The first one is genetic identity, that is the biological similarity or difference between ethnic groups or populations. And the second one is what effect genetic factors have on our traits. The first one we need to talk about is the issue of genetic identity. Who you are, and to what extent does your genotype form part of your identity. This is Richard Lewontin, a famous evolutionary biologist, who in 1972 published a landmark paper where he made the claim that there is in fact more genetic variation within than between populations. This was arguably the most dangerous and misleading piece of scientific fact of all time. We really need to spend some time on this, as this is so greatly important, as it is used to justify so much of our social policy in the Western world today. So do we really have more genetic variation within than between populations? The answer is yes, this is technically true, it just doesn't actually mean what Lewontin implied. The fact that there is more variance within than between doesn't say anything about how similar or different people really are. The terms variance and mean are conflated as if they meant the same thing, whereas these 2 are actually distinct concepts. Variance means how much variation, spread, or diversity exists in the dataset, whereas mean distance would mean the actual difference or similarity between populations. Lewontin measured variances, yet he presented his results as if they were the mean difference. I know this sounds very confusing, so let's clarify this a bit further. So the way Lewontin's claim is usually understood is to the effect of saying that 2 random people from one ethnic group could be less similar to each other than to someone from another continent. Later on, Lewontin himself made this claim explicitly. He said that there is no greater similarity occurring between Western and Eastern Europeans than between Europeans and Africans. This forms the scientific basis for the justification for mass immigration, as if the above was really true, then it could really mean that someone from Africa could potentially be more similar to native Europeans than we are to ourselves. To illustrate how widespread this belief is, here are some clips from a particularly notorious propaganda piece, The Human Family Tree.
Like all of our other physical differences, the genetic changes responsible for our varying shades of color are minuscule. Just a handful of mutations out of the more than 3 billion letters in the human genome form the foundation for humanity's entire notion of race. Tangible proof of something Dave and his girlfriend Michelle already know.
Race is just, it doesn't really mean much. I mean, people are different, but I don't base anything on a person's race.
For all the problems race has caused, our differences are literally not more than skin deep. Genetically speaking, race does not exist. And some, like Dave Reed's ancestors, would turn left and take the M173 towards Europe, leaving us with one obvious question. If Dave's markers trace back to this early European trek, why doesn't he look European?
Now I'm going to switch all the way to the other extreme of the globe. This big group over here, the Europeans.
At the end, where the participants' genetic ancestry is dramatically revealed, we end up having several African individuals amongst the European group.
Supposed to be European. I said, how did that happen?
I'm questioning my own self. How is it possible? How is it possible? Because I thought it had to be straight up from Africa.
Dave Reed was wondering the same thing.
And I never thought that I'd be standing with the Europeans and not the Africans. It kind of breaks all the molds on race and what people think about where they come from, and I can't wait to bring it home and show my parents.
What they've done here is really quite deceptive, as the general message that most people will take home from this is that someone from Africa could just as easily be genetically European as the actual natives. Now, of course, I have edited the verse bits together, but still, what you have seen is still quite representative of both this show and how the rest of popular science perpetuates Lubontin's fallacy. In the meanwhile, actual research done on the same subject revealed something quite different. In a study by Witherspoon et al., actual genetic similarity was measured on a larger scale as the average pairwise difference between individuals. And what they've actually found laid Lubontin's claim to rest for once and for all. This diagram is from the paper, which shows the probability of an individual being more similar to someone from his non-native group as a function of the number of genetic variants considered. As you can see, this converges to 0 as we increase the number of markers. So what they found was that if you just look at 10,000 markers, then the possibility that an individual would be more similar to someone from his non-native population was effectively 0%. And the search genomes differ at least 4 million sites between individuals. When considering the whole person, this is always going to be the case. So you will always be more similar to someone from your own ethnic group than to outsiders. But why is this important? What are the implications? The social implications are enormous. To understand why, we need to understand what greater genetic similarity means. In short, it means more commonality, more shared identity, and therefore common interests. To understand why this is the case, let's have a quick review of what we know how genetic factors influence our traits. You may have heard that our genes influence pretty much everything about us, including health risks such as cancer, susceptibility to various illnesses such as sickle cell disease or Alzheimer's. In addition, they also have an effect on non-disease traits such as high altitude adaptation or lactose tolerance. So depending on the genetic variants you carry, you may have a different probability of developing such a trait. As a matter of fact, the distribution of these traits is not uniform, but instead follow a distinct geographic pattern. For example, it is far more common to be lactose tolerant among those of European descent, whereas high altitude adaptation is more frequent amongst the people of Tibet. In both cases, variants conferring these abilities reflect the different life histories of these populations. And as we have seen, you share more genetic material with members of your own population, which then will also mean that you will share more traits with them that are more common in your own group. So far so good. None of the above is particularly controversial. Now here's the bit which may still sound controversial. The distribution of genetic variants that influence our brain and cognitive abilities actually also differ. There is no qualitative difference between genes that affect how we digest milk and those that influence brain development. In other words, there is no reason to believe that evolution stopped below the neck 50,000 years ago. There is actually now some good evidence to support this. This is from a recent paper from the journal Cell. In short, what they've done is illustrated by the diagram on the left. They've took a large number of individuals with diverse ancestors of background, then performed an MRI and also genotyped them. And finally, compared these two to check what effect genetic ancestry had on their brain structure. The results are shown on the picture on the right, which demonstrates how our brains differ as a function of our genomic ancestry. YRI is an African group, whereas CEU represents peoples from Central Europe, and EA represents Asia. And here's the same thing as animated. As you can see, there are systematic differences in cortical structure between Africans, Europeans, and people from Asia. Now, the authors don't make any specific claims as of how this would impact our personalities, or who has the, quote, better brains. But it is hard to argue that this would have no noticeable influence on our group behavior. In plain English, this means precisely what you've been told your entire life to be not true, that people do differ in fundamental and inherent ways based on their ancestry. This is an emerging consensus in the biosciences. Everything we have found so far in the past decade or so points towards this direction. Wherever we look, we seem to find more and more differences. While all of the above is in the public domain and were picked from mainstream journals, they are still mostly hidden in plain sight. What as the skeletons we keep falling out from the closet, it may soon even overflow into the public consciousness. The importance of which cannot be overstated, as once that happens, it will delegitimize the factual basis of egalitarianism and expose its true religious nature, and over time, it will be moved onto the same platform as any other religion. But of course, Christianity, Islam, etc. will not be given up by its believers just because their factual basis have been exposed as fairy tales, and there is no reason to believe that this would happen to egalitarianism either. Exposing the factual basis of egalitarianism as lies is just the first stage. In order for it to be fully disposed, it must be exposed as a false god and be replaced by an alternative morality. Which brings us into the next part. The moral or philosophical basis for taking a position based on your identity. So we are not technically all born equal, but why should we at least try to be them? As a true believer may argue that facts are just simply a problem to be overcome, as if we cannot all be equal. What's left then? The morality of the West today is a religion in its own right, with a set of unwritten but very strictly enforced taboos that instinctively everyone observes. The most important ones are a set of moral codes on how to deal with human differences. It is actually impossible these days to point out that someone is not like the rest, or that, God forbid, someone doesn't really belong to your in-group. In polite society, you will immediately lose status if you ever make such a comment. Just think about human rights laws, equality legislation or gender quotas, etc. All of these are aimed at the single purpose of abolishing human differences. The worst thing that you could be accused of today is to be in a breach of these, that is to be intolerant, xenophobic or racist. As basically all of these amount to the same thing, to not to support or drive towards greater and greater universalism. If you look back at our history, you could see it as one continuous progress towards the eradication of all differences, starting from Christianity, through the French and Bolshevik revolutions, up to the multicultural societies we see today. So while science is eventually always going to support the truth, defeating a religion is a far more difficult problem, as its roots are not fact-based, therefore they cannot be defeated on those grounds only. So first, we need to fully understand what we are dealing with. We need to review this religion of ours and expose its core tenets. Basically, the religion of equality is the most powerful religion of all times, since it denies its own status as simply just another religion, but rather it presents itself as the ultimate truth above all other faiths. It is only possible to remain a Christian, a Buddhist or a Muslim, as long as you subscribe to the core beliefs of equality. And these other religions are basically seen as lifestyle choices, hobbies that you are free to engage in your free time, as long as they don't interfere with the one true faith of equality, of course. This makes modern liberals look particularly bad, as they pride themselves as people who have moved beyond the irrationality of faith, whereas in fact, they are the most fanatic zealots that the world has ever seen. So let's delve deeper and lay bare some of the core principles of the secular religion of the West. In short, its aim is to erase all forms of boundaries which are seen as oppression, even reality itself. It is to believe that the purpose of mankind is to eradicate all distinction between genders, classes, and peoples. Mankind is basically seen as a species of flawed and incomplete beings, fallen angels that have reached the end of their evolutionary potential. And modernity's goal is to merge all our souls into a single, unified being. These clips are from the film End of Evangelion, which in a very abstract and metaphoric way summarizes the human condition quite well. In the movie, a shadowy organization is arranging what they call the Human Instrumentality Project, which aims to merge all our souls into an undefined singularity, where individual forms no longer exist. Your personal goal is believed to be the eradication of your ego via self-realization of your innermost desires in a single, orgasmic moment of ecstasy, and then bursting and melting into the same primordial soup of life from where we have all once came from. At the end of the movie, the protagonist rejects this merging of all souls project, but not because he has a better idea, but simply because he's just too honest and sees through the deception that this world wouldn't be real, and that reducing all unique beings into a single biomass is just wrong. The film offers no permanent solution, however, as the protagonist is well aware that once individuals regain the unique forms, the pain of rejection and the unreturned love of another will return at the same time. To illustrate this, the first thing he does to his archetypical Eve is to try to strangle her, which very tellingly was the same act that initiated the project in the first place. We need to do better than that, as otherwise we will always be seen as either sulking introverts or haters who just cannot have a good time by always having to ruin the party by pointing out inconvenient facts. We must offer a better alternative that is not only achievable, but it is even more radical and idealistic. Criticizing their position is not enough. You cannot just be a reactionary, as that will be seen as someone who is scared of change or progress. You will want to offer an even more extreme alternative. In the film, the protagonist is trapped within his own self, and as such, there was no solution. But we can actually solve this problem if we think outside of the box. If you cannot solve this problem the way we are, then we just have to change ourselves. Once you have realized the futility of self-realization, that our feelings are just a dead end to nowhere, the solution becomes obvious. It is to rise above yourself, your petty concerns, and strive towards self-transcendence, towards a higher ideal. You can do this individually, or better as a people. And you can only strive towards greatness if you value who you are now, what set you apart from the others in the first place. If we reduce ourselves into a jello of biomass, that will surely prevent us from getting there. The answer to this is not an apology or doubling down on pandering, but to embrace the concept of moving beyond, surpassing oneself. If you are aiming to transcend your humanity, then losing it will not seem to be a problem. And emotional blackmail such as this will no longer work on you either. Those who appeal to our common humanity are actually regressive, as they want us to return to an earlier, undifferentiated state of mankind. Whereas those of us with a tribal consciousness are often criticized as reactionary. Whereas the opposite is true, as differentiating into tribes is the first step towards leaving our old selves behind. Just think about this. If we were always born equal, or if that was ever a good thing, we would never have changed from apes into what we are today. Everything that we value today, all art, technology, or very civilization, everything that is beautiful and perfect is the result of someone being born better than the rest. Someone born better, who also took advantage of it. Trying to force equality on people would destroy all beauty and any future possibility of improvement. But once you realize that difference is the ultimate moral good, you will strive for distinction instead. On the other hand, holding equality up as an ideal for society amounts to holding back everyone, as the very concept of equality itself is based on the negation of achievements greater than the average. The very essence of evolution and true development is difference, or inequality. Conversely, a culture that prizes equality as its highest social virtue is likely to stagnate and then slowly decay. From evolution, we know that no species lasts forever. One way or another, we will change into something else. We all have the choice of what we are going to change into. So the philosophical answer is to transcend our limitations by transcending our humanity. I do realize that all of this was perhaps a bit too abstract, so a practical example is in order. Think about space exploration. It isn't frequently mentioned, but as we evolved on Earth, our biology is profoundly unsuitable to life on other planets. How are we going to settle Mars? We are adapted to Earth-level gravity, no gamma rays, and of course, there isn't a whole lot of breathable atmosphere on the red planet. If we are going to settle Mars, it seems inevitable that we are going to have to change ourselves. So we now know that equality is not only impossible, but it is also immoral. The alternative morality is to embrace and value what sets you apart from others, and instead of leveling humanity, we should strive towards greater and greater differentiation. But how do you actually pull this off in practice? What can you say when someone accuses you of being a racist? How do you actually say, "You do not belong with us"? To find out, let's have a look at the final part, breaking the narrative. But before I would reveal what I think will work, first let's have a look at what will most definitely not work. This is Dr. William Shockley, a Nobel Prize-winning scientist who will demonstrate for us the absolute worst example that I could find on how to handle this problem.
Dr. Shockley, you are accused of having a theory that is a white racist theory. How do you respond to that?
Well, I respond to that by saying that I've considered whether or not I am a racist. Racist is an epithet that used to damage my self-esteem, but it doesn't anymore. I feel it's untrue. If you look in the dictionary as to what racist means, it means emotional feelings, irrational feelings associated with fear and hate. If I really had those, I don't think I would be here this evening. I feel that what I'm engaged in is a demand for diagnosis, and I'd like to say some more about this chart, which we'll come to probably later, which shows the disproportionate rates of reproduction for the least effective elements of the black community.
And then he goes on to show some graphs on IQ differences. It could work great as a comedy sketch, but sadly he was for real. He really thought that was going to work. Let's have a look at another poor attempt, this time by a politician.
Hello, my name is Paul Weston, and I am a racist. I know I'm a racist because I'm told I'm a racist by a great deal of people. The hard left think I'm a racist. The Labour Party thinks I'm a racist. Conservatives think I'm a racist. Liberal Democrats think I'm a racist. The BBC thinks I'm a racist. So I must therefore be a racist. Why am I a racist? So we need to denounce it for what it is. And we need to start mounting some sort of defence against this. But the trouble with mounting a defence against it is that you get hit with the racist accusation. I'm not a racist, but. Well, here's the thing. I am a racist. If I want to avoid a civil war happening in my country, I am prepared to accept being called a racist. And you should be prepared to accept being called a racist as well.
Well, I disagree. I don't think that you should accept it. Overall, a slightly better effort, but still, we should be able to do much better. So, what went wrong? First, going on an Afrocentric TV program, then citing science journals to encourage African Americans to castrate themselves is obviously a really bad idea. Admitting that you are racist and saying that you're even proud of it is also a pretty bad strategy as well. It just amounts to admitting that you're evil and immoral and just simply don't care. People use labels to inform your social status, which will then determine your social respectability. A variation of this latter is to try to accuse your opponent of racism, trying to twist their words to make them look even worse than yourself. I've never really seen this work either. Finally, the worst possible thing you could do is to try to appease your opponent by adopting their ways, by showing that you are not racist. This strategy is also likely to fail. Or even worse, if it were to succeed, you would have become the very thing you have set out to combat in the first place. Let's take a look at each of these in turn and see what went wrong and how you could improve your performance. So let's start with some basic common sense. When to pick a fight? This one should be obvious. When the odds aren't against you, don't pick a fight with someone much stronger than you. Trying to win such an argument against people who hold authority over you, such as your boss, supervisor, or landlord, will not end well. Don't put yourself into an impossible situation like that. If you're outnumbered or outgunned, just run and live to fight another day. And finally, Don't waste your time on arguing against those who could never agree with you, people who have an existential interest in keeping you out. Under these headers I mean minorities, Marxists, or those too affluent that have too much to lose by abandoning the status quo. These people will only ever see you as an opportunity for moral posturing, so try to avoid them at all costs. Second, you should only ever engage in such confrontations if you can hope to achieve something positive. This may be convincing someone of your point of view, or to spread this meme. So don't give in to the temptation of engaging in fights just for the sake of it, which may be more difficult than it sounds if you are combative by nature. So the above was the most important. Nothing that I'm about to say after this point will do you any good if you don't pick your opponents and objectives well. So you went and done all of that, and then suddenly you hear the dreaded words. You're accused of being a racist. How do you respond to that charge? Your lifelong programming is about to kick in. You start to sweat, you're lost for words. Something terrible is about to happen. You are just about to raise the white flag. I've even seen some otherwise really tough men getting tripped up by this. An instinctive reaction of self-admitted guilt is put on display. They make excuses like, I am not a racist but, and then try to prove their innocence by making various excuses. But let's hold on for a sec. What does this really mean at all? Who is a racist? What's the meaning of this term? It means that you have broken the moral code, that you're a heretic, a witch, who is about to burn on the stake by the Inquisition. So if we were to restate this charge as being accused of being a witch, how would you handle that? What would you actually say? And I don't mean that just metaphorically, but actually. What would you actually do if you were being accused of being a witch? That you have made a pact with the devil? Would you say that it wasn't you who made the pact, but someone else? Or would you say that you haven't seen the devil since at least last week? Or that you have looked up the definition of a witch in a dictionary and you don't think you qualify? You would just laugh and move on. And that is pretty much what you need to do for the real thing, as the charge is essentially the same. People are no longer not burned on stakes for witchcraft because they have convinced the Inquisition that they are not witches, but simply because people no longer believe that witches exist. Of course, the difference is that people still believe today that racism is real, so you will actually have to address this issue and answer them properly. Yet, the solution is going to be the same. You will just have to convince your opponents that what they believe is not real, rather than trying to defend yourself against the charge itself. This may sound almost the same, but there is a world of difference. So let me elaborate on this a bit further. You see, this isn't about one argument against another, but one worldview versus another. If their narrative triumphs, then that means that the only role available for you in their play is the role of the villain. And the only way to avoid that is not by saying that you are not playing the villain, but are actually one of the good guys, but to point out that their game is bogus. Don't say that you are not a racist, but instead that there is no such thing as racism, that it is a meaningless term, an invalid concept, and that you reject the very terminology of it. You may think that I am obsessing over just words, but there is more to it. If you look carefully at these everyday phrases, you may notice something. These are all value-laden, professionally constructed weapons in the shape of words that carry within them an entire worldview. You may find it very difficult to win an argument if you are using too many of these terms, because they are all somehow magically loaded with your opponent's ideology. But of course, there is one word to rule them all: racism. Literally, billions of dollars were spent to compress a large chunk of an ideology into this single word that was constructed in such a way so that it can only be used in one way. Just like in Tolkien's world, the One Ring can only ever be used to ultimately carry out the Dark Lord Sauron's will. Using charged words like that is a little bit like making a purchase on a marketplace. Each term can only be used appropriately, or you have to pay their price. How about a pound of racism, please? That will be $2 billion, sir. So how do you win this war of the words? As you're unlikely to be a billionaire, and therefore cannot afford a hard counterattack, the best you could do is to employ asymmetric warfare tactics. Simply move the goalposts by avoiding the terms that they have monopoly over, and use different ones to describe the same thing. And if you're forced to use their terms, then only ever do so to discredit the very concept of them. Let's have a look at a few important examples. First, of course, is racism itself. I strongly suggest that you never use this term in any context. If you must, however, make an explicit reference to the problem, then simply replace racism with the term ethnic conflict, as it implies a certain sense of mutuality. What about the race concept then? This one is difficult as well. While there is enough evidence to suggest that there are meaningful differences between human populations, that doesn't mean that you should attempt to resurrect the race concept itself. But that is actually besides the point. We don't need races for people to be different. Just because the colors of the rainbow blend into each other, that doesn't invalidate the concept of different colors. And that is what people are truly interested in. We don't really care if someone belongs to a certain race. What we really want to know is if someone is fundamentally different from us. So the bottom line is that at least in the Western world, this term seems to be beyond recovery. It is impossible to use it in any context without having to deal with extremely negative connotations. So for both scientific and technical reasons, avoid it altogether. Instead, try to use peoples or the more formal term populations. Other alternative terms I quite like are native or indigenous, as they imply a biological component. Finally, try to avoid terms that use superficial attributes, such as those referring to skin color, as they will make your arguments look shallow as well. By using a different vocabulary, you should try to assert your own narrative, a different worldview in place of the mainstream. Like in that movie The Cell, where the plot involved a scenario where the protagonist had to travel into the mind of a psychopath to discover the location of his latest victim. But the problem was that while she was trapped in his mind and in his dream, it was impossible for her to challenge him. The way they solved this was to change the dreamer to the heroine. And your job is the same. It is to break out from their story and establish yours. Let them be the villain in your story. So to summarize, if you stop playing the game, then you can stop being the villain. If it's your world, then it's your rules. Start all your answers with "there is no such thing as A." Then by choosing your words very carefully, assert your own narrative. I cannot possibly cover all the different scenarios and provide a comprehensive guide on how to deal with each situation. Also, I don't think that having a single mantra that you could just mindlessly repeat would work either. Mantras are not flexible, and since they never change, your opponents will quickly learn them and then develop an immunity which will then allow them to easily quarantine you away. What you want to do is to make your own local adaptation of the following template. There is no such thing as racism. The concept of racism is defined as the moral failure of treating people differently, whom we believe to be the same. But it is just plain dishonest to pretend that we are. Therefore I cannot be guilty of something that doesn't exist. Now of course this is not what you would actually say, but this is what you should mean. How you actually say it will depend on your current scenario. In fact, in most situations, you wouldn't need to do much more than to simply roll your eyes, and that should express the same thing. The point is to discredit the concept itself. It's about making the term racism lose its currency. At the end, it should have no weight when thrown around. You just have to find the most effective and practical way of achieving that. At a science conference, of course, you would need to have done more homework and be prepared with some citations. In a philosophical debate, you could draw on part 2 of this presentation, plus do more reading of the works of Nietzsche, for example. Having said that, before we wrap this up, I'd like to share a few practical tips that should help you to get started. Let's take things in order. Let's start with a science-themed practical scenario. In the coming years, as the last remnants of any scientific credibility of egalitarianism are going to be eroded by modern research, it will become less and less likely that your opponent should choose science to support his arguments. But today, it is still very much possible that they first attempt to make a scientific claim, similar to those what you have seen in part 1. There are two basic possibilities. The first one is that they will make broad scientific claims without any evidence, that science has long proven that we are all the same, but only really to support their underlying morality. Against this, you should first point this out, that they are in fact not making a scientific argument, that they are just really applying a morality. To finish them off, you should try to draw a parallel between creationism and liberal beliefs in equality. They shouldn't be difficult, as they really are the same thing. Second, if they really are trying to make a science-based argument, well then you should be well prepared with your own list of facts. They should not be too difficult either, as there is now plenty of good research in the public domain that you could draw on. Next up is the moral or philosophical debate. As a philosophical debate is inherently non-practical, there isn't much I could say here, just refer back to part 2. You could also draw Nietzsche's works, especially where he deals with systems of values and the importance of who defines morality, as essentially what you will be disagreeing on are the very definitions of what it means to be good or evil. In practice, it is quite unlikely that you would have to engage in a full frontal philosophical confrontation, but it is quite possible that your opponents will use a mixed strategy, where they would use a moral coating on the otherwise practical or scientific arguments. To deal with this is my suggestion. First, point out that the morality is based on scientific falsehoods, and as such, a morality based on falsehoods must therefore be a false morality. Try to avoid sounding too sciencey though. People who make decisions based on moral principles aren't always impressed by what is actually true. In that case, try to show that equality and true human development are antitheses of each other. The point is, as always, is to discredit the concept itself. At last, if you are talking to a close friend, you may not even need to make a verbal effort. The fact that you are no longer believing in the modern-day equivalent of witches and heretics, that you are no longer spellbound to this morality, will be obvious no matter what you say. Ultimately, this is going to be the most important arena, as real change will only happen once a critical mass of individuals will stop believing in racism, and that is much more likely to happen in a pub or in the living room than anywhere else. Just think about it. 100 years from now, calling someone racist will have the same effect as calling someone a heretic, a witch, or a kulak today, and will be seen in the historical context as essentially a different version of the same thing. When you are with a close friend, you can pretend that this has already happened, and eventually it will happen for the rest of society at large. Finally, never apologize. Don't say that you're sorry because you really aren't. Trying to backtrack never works either, because it will look like an admission of guilt, and they will never let you off the hook anyway. Just stick to your guns and fight it out. So we have reached the end of this presentation. Where to go from here? Practice makes perfect, so I recommend that you organize into small groups where the following scenarios could be played out: science conference, TV show, at a dinner party, informal conversations, and finally at a pub or with your family. For best results, choose one of you who will take on the role of the witch, and then the rest of them will try to accuse him of being a racist and see what strategy works best. And finally, don't forget to have fun.